What they used to do in Kinlochleven then, they would be doing it in London, Birmingham and Manchester, maybe months afterwards.
At the turn of the century, one product above all else inspired the hearts and minds of the British business community. Because of its infinite applications, this youngest, brightest and lightest of metals had become more precious than gold. But to manufacture it, you needed to generate a lot of electrical power. And to source a cheap, renewable supply of fuel to create that power, the surveyors and engineers came here, to what was to become the biggest hydroelectric scheme of its kind in Europe. This is the story of that metal, aluminium, and in particular the people who helped manufacture it in this area, that gave birth to the electric village. In 1901, the Lochleven Water and Electric Power Company, supported by the then young British Aluminium Company, obtained permission by Act of Parliament to utilise the water from the Blackwater Valley and the Loch Eilde area up and beyond the head of Lochleven in order to create cheap and plentiful hydroelectric power, essential for the economical production of aluminium. Surveys were made, complicated land deals were struck, and eventually, in 1904, work began. This new and gigantic scheme was to comprise first of an enormous dam, in its time the biggest in Europe, built on the west side of Ranach Moor, 5.5 miles from Lochleven and 1,000 feet above sea level. A concrete conduit would be constructed, transferring water from the dam to a pipeline and eventually from there into the turbines of the new power station and adjacent aluminium reduction factory. New wharfs would be built to handle supplies by sea, and a small town would be built for the accommodation of the workforce. There was plenty of work for those prepared to travel to this remote area. Thousands of tons of earth had to be moved, and thousands of tons of concrete mixed by hand.
Though up may be up, and down be down, time will make everything even. And the man who starves in Greenock town will fatten at Kinlochleven. So what does it matter if time be fleet and life sends us no one to love us? With the dust of the roadway under our feet and a smother of stars above us.
And so they came, Gaelic speakers from the Highlands and Islands, local Scots and Irish. Their foremen or gangers had to be fluent in both Gaelic and English. The skilled navvies and unemployed migrants worked side by side in what was to become a landmark in the history of hydroelectric development, producing cheap power to fuel the electrolytic cells of the North British Aluminium Company's new Highland smelter. The majority of them lived here, just south of the dam, and the rest 5.5 miles away in what were then the tiny communities of Kinlochmore and Kinlochbeg. Lord Kelvin, the Scottish chairman of the British Aluminium Company, described the difficult project.
The high rainfall and the high hills surrounding the area, containing as they do many lochs and an abundance of water, makes Kinlochleven an ideal spot to generate cheap power for the express purpose of smelting aluminium. It's a savage area that will take some taming, but the British Aluminium Company shall not falter until the work is complete.
And tame it they did. Upwards of 3,000 navvies living and working in this hostile environment for almost 5 years. Of course, it provided much needed employment, but the powerhouses and reduction factory would change the face of the area forever. This backwater, nestling as it did on the edge of some of the wildest landscape in Britain, would never be the same again. Do you mind the night we laboured boys together?
spread-eagled at our work upon the joists, with the pulley wheels a-turning and the naphtha lights a-burning and the motor crawling upwards on the hoists. When our hammers cracked like blazes on the facing, when the trestles shook and staggered as we struck, when the derricks on their pivots strained and broke the crank-wheel divots and the...
Patrick McGill from Ireland, who worked here from 1904, described his arrival at the dam having walked from Glasgow in his book Children of the Dead End. The cold tang of the dawn was keen in our nostrils as Moleskin and I came upon the outer line of derricks standing gaunt against the bald cliffs of Kinlochleven. A sleepy hollow lay below, and within it a muddle of shacks were huddled together in bewildering confusion. They looked as if they had dropped out of the sky by accident. Day and night the navvies laboured, the bulk of the work done with pick and shovel. In winter the cold and damp taxed even the hardiest, and in summer plagues of midges drove them frantic. "Kill one," said an Irishman, "and 1,000,000 will come to its funeral." In order to apply for work, most of the men walked here from the south, and the last part of their journey from Glencoe took them over what was to be known as the Devil's Staircase. A tough but pleasant walk in summer and part of the now very popular West Highland Way. But in winter, theirs was a nightmare journey that claimed many a life, some disappearing without trace. These tragic deaths, either by accidents on site or by futile attempts to reach the King's House hostelry in Glencoe in winter, took a heavy toll. And one of the loneliest and most primitive burial grounds on the Scottish mainland bears witness to these forgotten souls.
Men from Ireland and that, and there's actually a graveyard near the dam. There's some actually died on the way because you had to come over the bogland.
And it was said that if some of them had a good pair of boots on their feet, they would take them off and put them on their own feet.
The dam, when completed, would be over 3,000 feet long, with a capacity of 3,930 million cubic feet of water. And the roofed conduit running for 3.5 miles is one of the earliest examples of large construction work in reinforced concrete. To get materials, more men and supplies up to the factory, everything had to be brought into the area by boat. The narrows on Lochleven had to be dredged, and over 500,000 tons of gravel had to be removed before steamers could make the trip. Wharfs were constructed, the foundations of which still stand today, and an early form of transport called a pug railway took supplies to the powerhouse and on up the steep incline to a temporary factory. An aerial railway called a Blondin was also constructed to carry supplies and provisions up to the workers at the dam in steel buckets hung from overhead cables. Over 50,000 tons of cement alone had to be moved up for the construction of the dam. Occasionally it was used by visiting packmen to sell their wares to the navvies.
There was quite a place at the dam. It was quite a township, as what Glencoe's known now as a town. Quite a lot of people lived there, you know, the builders and that. Of course, for somebody that's coming from Glasgow and go up in the Blondin to save that walk from Kinlochleven, and however to sell his ware, whatever the wares were, I suppose clothing, moleskin trousers and all this sort of stuff. And seemingly, whatever happened, whether it was by accident or somebody wasn't pleased with the bargain he had, they switched the Blondin halfway up. Now, I don't know whether it was ever discovered, but until the next day, but that was the story.
The Blondin also took alcohol to the navvies at the dam, but often the buckets were hijacked by more thirsty navvies working further down the glen. Eventually, in 1907, a wet canteen was built along western lines near the factory. It was quite the centre of social activity and provided cheap entertainment for the children of the village.
We would say, right, let's go up to the canteen to see the fights, because, and I have a recollection of, he must have been the ganger then, wielding a pick shaft to settle a battle that was going on between two men. And that was our entertainment, more or less.
Much later, in 1937, it was taken over by the Kinlochleven Improvement Society, and it was well kept and well run, with no real evidence of the heavy drinking and fighting that characterised the village in its pioneering days.
My brother, he was the manager there. That's him there. Dougie. He went away to the Air Force. He was flying and he was killed. And oh, it was a great place, the canteen. Well, there was two long counters, but one of them would be about 30 feet long. And to get a drink, you would have to get away maybe 2 or 3 deep from the counter. Oh, it was a busy place.
Fresh food supplies were always a problem, but in 1904 a temporary store was built behind the factory and close to the mortuary. In 1905 a post office was set up, which is still there today, and the authorities looked for a name for the new village. At first they decided on Aluminiumville, but thankfully they eventually settled on Kinlochleven. In December 1907, to fulfil a government contract, the first aluminium was produced in a temporary factory constructed higher up the valley. Aluminium postcards, gifts and medals were designed to honour the first smelting. The medals were inscribed with the Gaelic motto, Jainach Gian and Ishka Nur a Reinga Misha. What can water not do if it can make me? People came from far and wide to celebrate this momentous occasion and the birth of this new community. In February 1909, the main factory was in operation, employing upwards of 1,000 people. Single men were housed in hostels, but where possible, married workers lived in the compact little town of company houses. The town was modern, with its own school, healthcare, and the added advantage of free public and private lighting.
I was born in Kinlochleven in September 1915. The houses at that time were only on one side of the river. The other side had not been built.
The company was only allowed at that time to build on the south side of the River Leven, and this meant people lived in shadow for nearly 4 months of the year. They had little or no sunshine because of the high mountains behind. But people enjoyed living and working here. It was steady work and the wages were good for the area. The higher up the ladder you went in the company, the higher up the hill you were housed. The Kinlochleven Shipping Company and later McBrain's brought men and materials to the factory. Later, newly smelted ingots of aluminium were shipped out to Ballachulish. But the Great War changed all that. To start with, 1,200 German prisoners of war were billeted halfway up to the dam. They helped complete the new pipeline from Loch Eilde and a new road to Glencoe, still known as the German Road. The Germans were friendly and readily accepted by the local community.
There was about 2,000 German prisoners there, and they used to come down and work in the village. Oh, they were very good to all the young boys and that, you know, giving them different toys they would make.
I couldn't remember the faces. I remember the boots, and some had the jack boots.
It was supposed to be the most expensive road in this Britain. There's so many turns and rocks. Instead of blasting the rocks away, they just went round them. That's why there's so many corners in it.
Local men who left to fight in both world wars were replaced by a female workforce. drafted into the area and housed in new hostels behind the post office.
Some of them married in the village and stayed here. They worked in the factory, they drove the cars, they did practically everything that a man did. That was also the case during the Second World War.
Elsewhere in the village, those workers lucky enough to have a company house were looked after by the company in a variety of different ways, from basic house repairs to education and, of course, employment.
If there was anything wrong with your house, you went and reported it, and they would come and either paint your house or do joinery work, or if your chimney had gone on fire, they would come and clean your chimney.
Well, Kinlochleven, it was very advanced. Every house in the village was lit with electric light, and every street was lit. They used to call it the Electric Village at one time, when I was young. And the Garden City was another name it had. Everyone had beautiful gardens.
My old father used to say, you know, Kinlochleven was lit by electricity when Buckingham Palace had gas and London had gas.
I went to my grandmother in Edinburgh, and I was in school there for some time, but I finished my school education in Kinlochleven. If you hadn't got any employment, the headmaster was willing to accommodate you to come back to school and study on your own. The metallurgical department were looking for an assistant. And so I applied for a job there, and the man who was in charge of the department, he said, well, come and I'll see what you can do.
During the war years, the town grew. As the demand for aluminium increased, so the company flourished. The industry didn't suffer from interwar depression, as in times of slackness the young bachelor workforce were the first to go, and acted as a kind of buffer for the rest. Up at the dam, 2 watchmen and their families lived all year round and had to be supplied by pack horse. In the school holidays, it was the job for young boys to make the long trek.
What did happen, we learned a way of making a comfortable thing on the horse's back, so that you could lie on top and even go to sleep. I don't remember anybody falling off, but we did about 4 miles in the mountain until we came to the steep descent of the Ilklane. You had to then take control of your horse. But on that first 4 miles on the conduit, you could sleep on a hot summer's day on a horse and not fall off.
Well, in 1942, I first came to the Highlands, to Ballachulish. I met my wife, Isabel Marquis. Her job at that time was known working with the electric cars that pulled all materials, alumina, anything the factory, cryolite, anything the factory wanted. And of course, took the aluminium ingots back to the pier to be shipped out down Lochleven to Lochlinney and then out to the sea. There was 3 cars, and there was a driver to each, and here she was what was called a rope runner. She would change the points for whatever place they were going into the factory.
The mixtures of locals, casual workers, displaced Europeans and the female workforce made Kinlochleven a lively and social place. Shinty, and in particular football teams, sprang up everywhere, up to 15 in the 30s and 40s. And the riverside and island parks became the centre of activity on a Saturday, competing with the company's new cinema.
Even the battleships came into Ballachulish Bay, and some of the Navy boys used to come up with their pinnaces and play the local teams here in the Highland Park.
Then we were one of the first places in the country to get talkies. We got them round about the same time as the Edinburgh Playhouse.
People round about from Ballachulish and Glencoe used to come up in buses to the cinema on the Thursdays and And of course, during the war and that, it was a place of entertainment. The matinees was a penny. And then I think it was increased to 1 shilling and 6 pence in old money. Kinlochleven was pretty close-knit, you know, and there was never any trouble really in the village. We're all pretty good types, but if somebody stepped out of line, you know, did something wrong, made a nuisance of himself, he would be sacked. And the phrase was, "You're for down the loch."
Everything was there. There's the village hall, the dances. They used to have an aluminium queen dance. All the Kinlochleven had its Highland games.
At that time, they had everything here. It was on the map. Oh, what they used to do in Kinlochleven then, they would be doing it in London, Birmingham and Manchester, maybe months afterwards.
The success of aluminium, often called the obliging metal, resulted in the growth of the company and the village. It was used for everything from cutlery and cars to aeroplanes.
In the factory at Kinlochleven, lorries were waiting night and day. Whenever the metal was cool enough to be placed on a lorry without burning the lorry, then it was hurried away.
The research centre attached to the factory at Kinlochleven also had its successes, both in creating new processes and applications and in exporting skilled technicians and expertise to new smelters the world over.
Nearly everybody in that team was given a department of their own.
The process of producing and smelting aluminium hasn't changed in conception since the first ingots were struck here in 1907. Water, discharged from the dam, is still carried by the original 8-foot square box-sectioned reinforced concrete free-flow conduit, 3.5 miles to the lower penstock chamber, and then transferred into the original 6 39-inch diameter steel pipes, made up in 20-foot sections and conveyed to the powerhouse 1.5 miles away and over 900 feet below. However, this could have been interrupted if the German Luftwaffe had made capital of this extremely well-focused reconnaissance shot taken of the smelter in June 1940. A bomb was dropped on the Lochaber smelter pipeline, but was defused after failing to explode. At the power station, the water, now under extreme pressure, is directed into the turbines. 11 Pelton wheel turbines, each one driving 2 DC generators, produced 2,000 kilowatts of power, 22 megawatts in total. Some of them are the original machines that were installed in 1909. In 1996, a 10 megawatt alternator was added to produce power for the grid and Lochaber smelter. A further 2 were installed on smelter closure to retain maximum benefit of the water. The cell room where the aluminium is actually produced has electrolytic cells connected together in series and operating at a current of 40,000 amps with a DC voltage of 4.4 volts across each cell. This extreme power is required to sustain molten baths of cryolite in the cells at an operating temperature of 970 degrees Celsius. Aluminium is refined from alumina, which is fed into the molten cryolite. Alumina, in turn, is extracted from bauxite, a naturally occurring red clay on the Earth's crust. Bauxite, after it is mined, is digested with a caustic soda solution. The red clay mud is siphoned off, allowing separation of the alumina. In the electrolytic cell, the alumina is held in suspension in the molten cryolite bath. The current passes by means of these steel electrodes to the carbon anode and then down through the bath in which the anode is partially submersed to the carbon cathode at the base of the cell. The current passing through the bath separates the alumina into its component parts of aluminium and oxygen. This process is known as electrolysis. The separated aluminium falls in a fine mist through the cryolite to form a pool lying on the top of the cathode. This pool of molten metal is regularly tapped from the cell by suction using compressed air. And then transported to the casting shop where the aluminium is cast into ingots and prepared in stacks for transportation to the customer. At its height, the factory produced over 11,000 tonnes of high-quality aluminium a year, and everyone benefited from its success. The plant was very much the benefactor of the village. Most of the communal activities and events in the village were funded and provided by the smelter, both in materials and labour. A mini welfare state existed. The smelter remained the steadfast heart of the community over many decades, surviving floods that demolished the village's tartan hotel, serious water pipe bursts and droughts that caused severe low water levels in the dam. In the mid-1980s, difficult circumstances within the original company were relieved by a merger with Alcan Aluminium. Quite ironic, really, as Kinlochleven expertise had helped the fledgling Canadian aluminium industry, and now a Canadian company would ensure their survival. In 1994, the name changed yet again to Alcan Smelting and Power UK. By this time, the smelter was the oldest and smallest smelter still in operation in the Western world. And although it continued to produce high-purity aluminium in an efficiently run plant with an employee safety record second to none, production costs became increasingly high. In the first year of the new millennium, the plant which had given so much over the years to the industry finally stopped smelting. Alcan, in a very carefully planned closure programme, worked hand in hand with the community to minimise the effect of the closure on the local economy. The entire workforce were retrained in skills that helped them with employment prospects out with the industry. Some were transferred to Kinlochleven's sister plant at Lochaber. Large areas of the village were landscaped with new access roads, car parks and recreational activities. A new small business park was built. The smelter laboratory was transformed into a first-class walker's bunkhouse. And on the smelter site, gardens are planned with a heritage centre that will dramatically illustrate the history of this unique corner of Scotland. Through imaginative planning, the area that once rang to the sounds of aluminium production now echoes to different sounds, generated by the determination and enterprise of the local people.